Okay, everyone, welcome to this afternoon's webinar, COP30, What Happened and What Next? A special webinar on COP30 from different faith perspectives, from some faith-based campaigners and activists who were at COP30 and are friends of the Faith for the Climate Network who will be sharing their experiences with us. Why are we hosting this webinar? Well, from my perspective, every year COP feels like a very complex affair. And we are often asked by people, so was it a failure or was it a success? And that's never an easy question to answer in a single phrase or a single sentence, because these sorts of supranational, international processes can seem like, you know, labyrinth. They're very labyrinthine, or they're like behemoths. Sorry for the biblical bias in this metaphor, but that's what it feels like. But we know that they are also a key moment. Despite being a key moment for us in the UK, we know that we had COP26 here on UK soil a few years ago. Many of you on this call would have been there. Giles and I and Roche, the Faith of the Climate team, were there as well. But since then, COPs have started to feel quite distant from us in the UK, even though we try and follow them, and we lose a sense of how they do or do not join up with our local or national priorities here. Or the other way around, whether what we're doing locally or nationally here lines up with what the global agenda for climate justice is. And then it doesn't help when the headlines are sometimes too simplistic or demoralizing, or in the case of the UK, when they're quite global north centric. Now, what do I mean by this? So, depending what sort of headlines you were following, you would have probably come away with the impression that this COP was a failure because there was no agreed roadmap to a phase out of fossil fuels. And that is not inaccurate. But there were also other priorities that were brought by campaigners and activists and communities from the global majority, the global south, that did see some significant wins, which I'm hoping our speakers will talk about, but which we didn't really hear about because of the way COP30 was covered from a UK perspective. So the reason why we are convening this webinar is not to say that there weren't failures about COP30, but what were they specifically? And if there were gains or successes, what were they specifically? And what can we, as people of faith in the UK, learn from both these failures and successes to make our work more relevant wherever we are, whatever faith tradition we come from? And to make this, I mean, I didn't even know if people wanted this webinar first, right? So I asked a question in a Faith the Climate newsletter, would you like a post-COP30 webinar? And I thought, well, if people say no, then we won't have one. It's fine. We'll just do an article on the website or something. But the vast majority of you did want a webinar. And I also said, well, what are your burning questions? Many of you had very, very good burning questions. So this is how today is going to work. The experts that we have here, who will be introduced by our chairperson and co-founder, Canon Giles Goddard, they've not prepared specific presentations or slide decks to tell you what happened. They're basically going to try and answer your questions. Now, there were very, very many questions, very good questions. What I've done is I've tried to sort them into four main questions that we will be able to address in some way in the time that we have. So basically, whatever specific items that you raised, I think they basically fall under four main umbrella questions. The first was, what actually happened at COP30? What did people of faith actually do? What about specific negotiations like loss and damage and so on? So that's the umbrella question. We'll look at that. And there'll be these bullet points you'll see of what you raised specifically. The second question was, we've had 30 COPs now. There's been more than 3 decades of UN climate conferences. So many of you had questions about the broader context of COP and whether it's fit for purpose, what do we do with it, and so on. So that's the second main question. The third question, I think, is many of you wanted to know, well, what can we learn from this COP or COP in general that we can apply in our own local context or with our own faith communities or with our politicians here in the UK? That's question 3. The fourth question, which I've left till last, is a kind of bigger picture, what next question, a so what question from a faith perspective. So what do we do as people of faith? given that this is the situation. And so we'll leave that till last. Um, yeah. And the experts that we've invited may or may not be able to answer every single point, but I think you'll get a lot out of today because it really is a webinar that we all wanted. And we have people who were actually there with lots and lots of expertise between them to be able to give us their perspectives. And I'm hoping that what this will all help us to do is just see how we can connect our faith perspectives, our faith traditions with our passion for climate justice and make sure that it joins up, whether we are acting locally with our own communities or if we are focusing on the UK as a national government or our different UK jurisdictions in the devolved jurisdictions, and how we might join all of this up so that it connects with the priorities of the vast majority of the world, the global majority, in the interest of climate justice. Because whatever we do, it has to be in solidarity and it needs to help and support those who have done the least to cause the climate crisis but are suffering its worst impacts. I don't need to tell you that that's what's happening now. We are hearing news about storms and destruction in Southeast Asia, and barely 2 or 3 weeks ago, it was the Caribbean and it was the Indian subcontinent. So very relevant today. I will stop talking now and introduce you to or part of, rather pass you on to our chair and co-founder, Canon Giles Goddard, Vicar of St. John's Church, Waterloo, and Chair of Faith for the Climate. Giles, over to you.
Thank you, Shannon, very much indeed. And thank you all for joining us on this webinar, which feels to me to be very significant. And I've just been reflecting very briefly on the part of faith groups in climate, but also in the COP talks. And I remember that Christiana Figueres in 2015 was very clear that the Paris Agreement was in some significant measure the result of pressure from faith groups. And she talked about how important the faith group voice was. And certainly when I was in Glasgow in 2021, there was a real sense that faith groups were pushing the thing forward. And we have continued. Faith groups can take a long view, often do take a long view, and we continue to be significant players in a world which is, as we all know, becoming increasingly challenging. So in that context, we're really honoured to have some very excellent speakers joining us today. Lindsay Fielder-Cook is the representative for the human impacts of climate change at the United Nations Geneva. She focuses on strengthening international efforts to transform root causes and reducing injustice. She's had over 25 years experience at the international level, and I've always hugely appreciated working with Lindsay, and I'm very grateful for all that you do, Lindsay, and will continue to do. We also have Graham Gordon, who I have to say I don't know so well, but I've enjoyed the conversations that we have had. Graham is head of global policy and advocacy at Christian Aid and was extremely involved, as he will tell us now in a few moments, in this most recent COP and making sure that the faith voice was heard there. And I'm really grateful. Graham's worked in advocacy for over 25 years, both at CAFOD and in Christian Aid, and for 6 years with the human rights organisation in Peru. And we also have Sonja Olsen with us, who's the national coordinator of Brahma Kumaris in Denmark and was a meditation teacher with the prison service in Copenhagen. She was instrumental in developing the Brahma Kumaris Environment Initiative back in 2009 and has been working closely with the Brahma Kumaris at the annual COP conferences since 2009. So as you can see, we have 3 people who have extensive experience of working on COP. And rather than you listen to me, I'd rather you listen to them now. So I will ask Rose to put up the first question. And perhaps we haven't discussed who's going to go first, but perhaps maybe Lindsay, would you like to go first on this one? And over to you.
Okay, and greetings all. It's really beautiful to see you all, and thank you for making time to be here, and thank you, Faith for the Climate, for everything that you do. I'm going to just take a couple minutes to look at these questions, and as was said, we each work in different areas, so we are not specialists on everything, but we will give you as much knowledge as we can in reflection. And I wanted to start by saying that the COPs, or the Conference of Parties for the Climate Change, is not the only solution to climate change. It's one of the critical solutions, but it's about global action. And if we think that everything's going to be solved there, we will be disappointed. On the other hand, it's an extraordinary space to bring countries together. So I want to give that perspective as well, because it also keeps us sane in what we're doing and why there, and dealing with the disappointments, while also really, and in our case at CUNO, watching the geopolitical shifts. Also to say that COP29 last year in Baku, Azerbaijan was brutal. And coming into Brazil, I actually felt quite hopeful, in part because it's under a democracy again, Brazil. It is a government which is extremely open-minded, progressive, and justice-based. Brazil is part of BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And in that combination, this is really the shifting power we have right now, because of course the US didn't show up. And that seeing that voice of justice and of nature from President Lula coming into this was actually really quite profound, plus their emphasis on ethics. So in saying that, I would say this COP of truth, which they called it, was a COP of truth, but not probably in the way they expected. And I would say that some cracks really opened in the ground. And as we know, when cracks open, flowers can bloom. So I'm going to share with you some of the cracks that we saw. CUNO, myself, we had been in Peru before this for the climate science, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So we had shifted from trying to protect science in the IPCC from political pressure into the COP 2 weeks later in Brazil. And we were seeing one thing, attack on the science, very effective strategies from certain countries that want very much to block this process, actually making quite disturbing efforts within this COP that I hadn't seen to that level. In that first week, we were also fighting to keep language that was pre-agreed to stay in text. I mean, these kinds of aggressive actions are tough. It was almost the sense of we are there to protect the Paris Agreement from being not, I wouldn't say dismantled, but really profoundly weakened. And then we had this shift coming into the second week, which was very odd because it was quite untransparent. The president kind of took the countries and stopped meetings. You couldn't really see the negotiations as much. But what was happening was one of the flowers that cracked was in the first time in 10 years, a real move of countries from developed and developing groups coming together and saying, we're going to actually get on with fossil fuel rapid reduction because this is ridiculous what is happening. We're in a process we can't even discuss fossil fuels. So we had this range of developed and developing countries giving press conferences in the second week about what they're doing. And I haven't seen that sense of energy and determination for this period. And so when I talk about cracks, it's almost you hit a crisis where you think, oh, we had this hope coming in with Brazil. They're stuck, but suddenly people are saying, no, it's not good enough and shifting. And that reflects a multilateral situation now, which is one of the most tense I've seen in my career at age 62 now. And how that's affecting and what people are sort of thinking, if that doesn't work, what could we do on the side that can pressure in? So just briefly, one of the things I would say, it exposed a lot of the blockages that we're seeing. It really exposed some of the strategies that are the patience for those countries is waning, I would say. The disappointments or the crises have actually shifted to maybe some opportunities coming in, like the roadmaps. The protection of science in the second week, we managed to hold firm, but it was scary, trying to actually eliminate reference to the IPCC, for example, by certain countries. Just transition, we had more rights language. We had recognition of people of African descent. We had some real strengths there. We also had a mechanism that the civil society brought together only months before that was recognized. So while this may not seem huge, for us it was very big. And then the role of the faith in negotiations. Again, more and more the values and the ethics that is coming out, and that Brazil gave us that real confidence and almost that upholding in that. Loss and damage. We normally follow loss and damage. We had less time this time, but I was able to talk to the co-chair of the Warsaw International Mechanism, the WIM, who was happy. The Secretariat was happy. They managed to get their review passed. it felt as if they were in a good place for moving forward. On the potential of tax justice movement, I'd love to talk about that later if it comes up. The COP is not a great place for innovative financing. I think that's where the nations have to get pushing on that because polluters pay. We have got to get finance from those who are most accountable. And we're stuck in a political situation where certain countries only want developed countries to do public funds. I can speak on that more later. I'm not going to speak much on artificial intelligence, except that within the IPCC, we have a real challenge coming up, and we need to see how we uphold that in terms of using it, but not letting it be abused. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lindsay. That's a really helpful summary of what happened. Graham, and then Sonia.
Great, thanks. Good to be here. I won't repeat what Lindsay said because she's covered a lot of the questions in some detail, but let me just highlight a few areas. One is that COPs, they always reflect global politics, but also local politics. So one thing we saw in Brazil was, as Lindsay mentioned, there was civil society space. So Indigenous voices were there very much in the media, outside the COP, marching, having the social summit. The tragedy was that only around 2,500, I think, got access inside the COP venue, and they had to kind of storm through the barriers to be heard. So even though it was set in the Amazon, and the kind of mood music was around deforestation, was around destruction of mining, was around lack of land rights, actually it didn't really enter into getting agreements on deforestation and some of those issues that have become part of COP in the last while, but it did kind of influence some of the national debates. And I think the benefit of having COP in any country is that it can shift domestic politics and move that forward. And the same with the church, I think. So the Anglican Church was very prominent. There was a Tapiri dialogue, which is a 5-day dialogue, looking at some of the challenges within the churches, actually, particularly some of the fundamentalisms, whether it's kind of political or economic fundamentals within the church that are influencing churches. Now, that was very useful for the church and the wider ecumenical movement. My reflection is that that didn't really land within the blue zone where the negotiations are and actually within the actual discussions themselves. And one of the reflections is churches, faith groups need to be very active at national level all throughout the year and not just wait till COP, because it's too late to influence once you've got to COP if you haven't been engaged already. So that's kind of some of the local. The global, as Lindsay said, alternative forms of finance, which is what we really need, kind of different forms of tax. They have grown in terms of interest globally, but they weren't key part of the discussions at COP. And so it go back to alternative venues are really places to look at progress there. But what you want is for COP at least not to block them. And that's often what you look at in global agreements. They actually reinforce the language. And some of the things around gender or around the other issues, you just want to hold fort and for it not to go backwards. So very little progress. If I look at the UK, they kind of similarly, no new climate finance from them. There was very little climate finance from anyone provided. I mean, the UK, it was a week before the budget, so they said very clearly, you're not going to get anything from us and you won't until next April. But they were very active on pushing for action on fossil fuels. And since then have implemented some of those commitments by a stronger commitment to no new kind of oil and gas fields in the UK. So we've actually seen the UK going to COP with a bit of pressure has then had to implement what they've committed to when they've got back home. So actually you need to look at it. There are multiple benefits that you can get, not just what comes out in the final statement. And then a couple more things to mention. There is, excuse me, there's huge progress on action that countries are taking. So in terms of the massive increase in electric vehicles, solar panels, China sees the green economy as a huge business opportunity. So you see huge progress, which is outside of some of these agreements. It doesn't mean the agreements aren't needed, but actually we can't just look at the success of COP based on what the the final outcome document is. You have to look at kind of what's happening in the real world, and various interesting articles from the FT this week and others showing how even Octopus Energy is investing in solar panels in Ukraine as part of an energy security approach, because actually if you have solar fields, it's much harder for them to be destroyed. It takes 40 times as many missiles to destroy the same capacity in solar as it does if you have oil or gas or coal. So it's actually, so you see some real world changes that are worth celebrating while still pushing for change in the formal processes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Graham, so much. I'm really taking from this that, the action isn't only focused on COP, but it's happening around it. And it's very good to hear that wider context. Sonia, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this program. And Lindsay and Graham, really good overview you've given. So I will give some additional experiences. And yes, the success of a COP is what's happening in the year in between. That's very clear. And I know from the beginning that it was going to be a very different COP, because the first letter we got from the COP30 president, they sent us 8 letters in total. And this was sent on March 10. And this was 10 values mentioned in the first paragraph. It talked about the COP on shared human values, and then it states peace and prosperity, hope and renewal, consideration and gratitude, unity and connection, resilience and optimism, generosity and kindness, diversity and inclusion. And this is signed by the COP president. And I thought, wow, a presidency listing 10 values in opening paragraph of the first COP letter, this is going to be a different COP. And yes, I felt that the Brazilian presidency, by bringing in the concept of mutirão, of collective spirit, working together, and also the ethical stocktake, was a turning point for the faith community, because suddenly our values, our work on justice, dignity, morals, values, was suddenly a legitimate part of the discussions and not a reflective afterthought. So the global ethical stocktake started like a year beforehand, and the Brazilian presidency, they invited all institutions, all countries, all organizations to reflect internally in their institution, in their personal lives. Why are we behaving like we are doing? Why do we go against science and traditional knowledge? What is the narrative in our community that correspond to a harmonious future? And very interesting questions. And in Brazil, they had maybe 10, 15 different pre-COPs in the country. And all organizations could send in the result of this global ethical stocktake to the presidency. And we got a letter of recognition even. So the spirit of collaboration, the ethical stocktake, was an opening door for the faith community to bring in their message in a very legitimate way. And I haven't experienced that since 2015, when Laudato Si came out for the Paris conference. And within one day after its release, suddenly it was very fashionable to have a person on the faith-based community in your panel. And I remember once just being asked by someone, do you want to come to speak to our panel? But I said, I'm not a Catholic. No, it doesn't matter which religion you're from. We just want someone from the faith-based community. And that was a little bit the same feeling I had this time. And in 2015, I remember the former president of World Council of Churches, he was saying now politicians are using the language of the religious people. So what language are we going to use now? He was asking himself.
Great.
So I had that feeling in Brazil. And I mean, yes, for the past 3 years, we've been in countries where there has been no real civil society forums. So last time was in Glasgow. So it was a big joy to have marches on the street, to have every corner, Amazon Hub, a TED Countdown House, the church was having masses every evening, a big march for 70,000 people, a boat demonstration on the Amazonas River, all of that. But on the other hand, we didn't have a faith pavilion this year. And the past 3 years it's been funded by the Council of Muslim Elders. For 3 years, they have funded the faith-based pavilion, and now they didn't do it this year. We're in a big Catholic country, and so we didn't have a faith pavilion this year. Right. So there's pros and cons by everything. And yes, just one little remark. You mentioned the indigenous community. Yes, it was a joy to have those inside COP who could make it in there. And I popped into the UK pavilion, and there was 5 indigenous people sitting there with their traditional dress in the panel, and one little British lady with high heels and a little blouse. And it was a very, very funny scene to watch in the UK pavilion. And of course, it was a joy to see them there, but also from time to time, you had a feeling that they were brought on for decoration purpose, kind of symbolic a little bit, and not really having a say in the negotiations.
Great. Thank you, Sonia, for that. So what I'm getting from this is that I'm feeling more, it's very good to have this behind the scenes take on things, because it's certainly not what was reflected in a lot of the reporting in the UK. So grateful to you for offering us that as well. I wonder if the three of you could give us a very short answer on the broader context, which is the next question, which is kind of around the role of fossil fuel lobbyists, whether we still have faith in the COP process, and the increase in climate change denial. I want to leave time for the last question, so maybe a brief answer. And can I come to you first, Sonia, this time?
Yeah, I will give a short reply. I will take up one example, and which is the role of faith is long-term work, and the fossil fuel is very short-term profit maximization. And in this sense, you can say it's an example of the common good versus the selfish interest.
Right.
And the Saudi Arabia is a very good example. Research is showing that Saudi Arabia will soon be inhabitable due to heat. They're not going to be able to live in this country due to heat. And at the same time, Saudi Arabia was the biggest blocker of the fossil fuel roadmap to phase out fossil fuels. And that's a dilemma you're facing in the world. And we face that dilemma so many places. So we just have to be reminded to place the common good in front of selfish interest in our own lives, in our own communities, whatever we do.
Thank you. I think I read somewhere that one theory is that Saudi is trying to make as much money as it possibly can before fossil fuels are phased out in order that it can become sustainable. But there's clearly an illogicality about that. But thank you very much for that. Lindsay, what are your thoughts on this wider context and the COP process, and what are the alternatives?
So on the first, I would say fossil fuel lobbyists, we are in a real profound pushback time. And it's not unexpected, because basically the main drivers of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are quite lucrative activities, most of them. On the denial, I just wanted to say, I think it's really important to engage with people, but not to think you can convince them. And we're not very good at telling the story of what we could be doing in a healthier way, a more equitable way. What societies could we be developing? It's almost like a rebirth. And so I would say, if in climate change denial, don't put too much energy into it. Really talk about the vision, because the vision of the more equitable ways we could be living, the more fair, the more cleaner ways, is a powerful one to then turn to our decision makers and say, why aren't you making these policies? And if you're not, why are you harming your citizens? And then briefly on what are the alternatives for COP? When I said the flowers were coming through the cracks, there is a conference in Colombia in April for those countries that came together, developed and developing, to say they wanted to act more on fossil fuels, right? I mean, things are starting to build. So the COP is important for that place, but the COP, as has been mentioned, I think, by both Sonia and Graham, is as good as what the national politics are pushing for. So it is critical what we do in our homes and our communities to then have a COP where those delegates are going to actually do something a bit more than the boring norm.
Thank you for that. And then next question that we're going to come on to is about local action. So it would be good to hear your thoughts more on that in a moment. But many, many thanks for that. Graham, what are your thoughts?
I think if we look at the way fossil fuels landed in the process, the surprise was that they were given so much space, because actually the formal process is that you have all of these pre-COPs, you build up the agenda's presented, which has already been agreed. President Lula brought in this fossil fuel roadmap as a kind of left field suggestion on day one. And the amazing thing is that half the countries there thought, yes, let's get on it. And so I always kind of compare COP to a bit of an abusive relationship where you're kind of offered lots of things and then they're slowly taken away from you. And then they say, well, come back next year and we'll have another, we're still committed, we'll have another go. But actually, what happened with fossil fuels was that they came. I think you can't put that genie back in the bottle now, even though it didn't land in the process. So all of these cracks that Lindsay's talking about, we need to really push them. And that's the same with the other issues like tax and debt. So I think because COP is the best known global process, the perception sometimes is it can fix everything, whereas actually it can't, and it's got certain focus issues. It should fix fossil fuels. That is a big thing that's missing. And I think over the next few years, it will start to. So as we as faith groups and engage, I think we have to have less presence at COP and more in other spaces, because we don't have infinite resources. I mean, if we could have as many people as COP, great. But actually, you've got to be looking at the regional climate spaces, the national advocacy, World Bank, IMF, some of the other institutions where the faith presence is much, much less, but where they're making significant decisions like the UN Tax Convention or kind of the G20 and the World Bank and the kind of debt mechanisms. They can make a huge, much bigger difference around finance. Yet probably we've got 1% of the faith groups there compared to COP. So I think it's kind of looking at a holistic approach. So yes, some faith, the COP process is part of it, but I think in our reflections, we need to stand back and take a kind of wider look. And also, I think one of the challenges this time was there wasn't a major theme of COP. We didn't go in thinking, this is the finance COP as it was last year. And so I think faith groups didn't necessarily mobilize around this is the one thing we want to achieve. And I think in our reflections and our planning for next year, we would do well to have one issue that we really focus on and we focus on throughout the year.
Wow, that's so interesting. And that's right. So I can feel my thoughts expanding as you speak. So huge thanks for that. And that leads us on to the next question, which is what next for local and national action? Before you answer that, I'm going to come to you first. Just to remind people, if you do have any questions that you'd like to put to the panel, please put them in the chat, because I'm hoping we'll have a few minutes at the end to take any questions that you've got. So do pop them in. I see we've got one already about shamanism. But Graham, carry on really with what you were just saying about local and national action and what you think we should be doing next.
My highlight at COP was going on a trip to the Quilombola community, so the kind of African descent community, with a group of about 15 Maori church leaders who'd been invited over by the Anglican Archbishop Marinez. And I was speaking to the Anglican Maori Archbishop in New Zealand, who said that the issues that the Anglican Church was dealing with in Brazil, so it was some of the kind of issues of employment, issues of waste, issues of energy, renewable energy. He said, we have these same issues of responding to disasters. And often the church is the first responder. He said, in our communities, we're the first responders. And he gave an example of when there was a flooding. Actually, the church was mobilized to provide food to the fire service, to the rescue service. And he said, this practical action gives us credibility when we then go to the government to ask them to take climate action. He said, in the context of New Zealand, it's a difficult situation. It's not a particularly open space to lobby, not particularly welcoming government, but actually the credibility of action allows the churches to have a very strong voice. So I think when we talk about a moral voice, I think we have to be, I think a practical voice gives us it gives a credibility, because a moral framing, lots of people are doing it and it's fine, but actually you've got to get in the door with the politicians. And I think in the UK, we've often found the same, that you can invite an MP to kind of visit a church and celebrate putting solar panels on the roof. It's a very practical thing. And then you have the discussion around why this is important and what they should do. So I think local action that leads to political action is one of the ways, as well as then a real focus on getting close to governments, lobbying governments kind of a year ahead of the COP on the domestic policies, on the implementation, because you will only bring to COP what you're happy to be doing at home on the whole. I mean, that's assuming complete integrity, which obviously there isn't. But I think governments that say, for example, will ban fossil fuels in the UK will be much happier to push it globally. If they're still kind of drilling, they're not going to push it globally because it'll have implications. So I think there's a lot more that we can be doing in our local communities, but it has to be political. It can't just be kind of a good kind of stewardship or practical action.
No, absolutely. It's so important, isn't it? And to hold climate justice right at the heart of everything as well. And if there was one, you've just said that you think we should unite behind one thing in the preparation for the next COP. Do you have an idea of what you would like that to be?
Well, I think it is fossil fuel action. And that's not Christian Aid's formal line yet. But I think it's one of those that 30 years after the Paris Agreement, or after 10 years after Paris, 30 years after the kind of climate agreement, if we don't tackle the production of fossil fuels, we're not going to reduce global warming in the way that we need to. And we're just going to need more and more money for adaptation, for loss and damage. So I think it's a clear issue of justice. You can get investment to leapfrog fossil fuels. It's an issue of development for many African and Latin American, Asian countries, and that has to be recognized. It's not a climate issue first and foremost for them. So actually it's an issue of the right to development, but with renewable energy investment, which is shifted from the fossil fuel subsidies, a lot can be done. So I think, and a big push for the kind of coalition of the willing on the outside, as well as for political action on the inside. I think that's certainly a front runner.
Thank you very much indeed. Sonia, and then I'll come to Lindsay, and then we'll do the last question. Sonia, what are your thoughts on this question?
Well, I was thinking a lot how to inspire your own communities, because in Brahma Kumaris now I've been involved nearly 20 years in how to mobilize Brahma Kumaris for more sustainable management of the center, personal lifestyle, retreat center, headquarters. And our initiative is based in internal work and also an advocacy work, and it turns out that internal management in a sustainable way, it's hard work. It's a lot of work needs to be done internally. So I find this how to inspire your community without blaming and shaming very interesting. And I found that within our community, I have to find a language that speaks to souls. So if I ask for a green coordinator from a country, no one will put the hand up. But if I ask for a green angel, for example, everyone put their hands up. So for me, it's very easy to engage people if I find a language that is suitable to their spiritual lifestyle, that speaks to them. Mm-hmm. And we can replace guilt with a kind of calling, a need. You are needed, you matter. You can replace fear with a vision. What kind of vision do you want to work with? We can replace perfection with a practice, one step at a time. And very important for our spiritual community to replace a statistic with stories. And you just have to find the language, the stories that speaks to the heart. And I find it quite easily to mobilize the community. So I'm not sure I agree with you, Graham, that we should participate less in COP and more in other forums. I think we should do both. And for that, we need young people, lots of young people. So every faith community just have to spot the young people and support them financially, time, whatever they need in order to become good climate ambassadors. And
Yeah.
just one more thing. We had a meeting with former director of PIC, which is the Government Climate Research Institute in Germany. You know him, Schellenhuber. And he gave us some advice on how to move forward as a faith-based community. And one thing he said, that unusual partnerships is very important because they will not be spotted by destructive forces.
Okay.
So you can flourish undercover in unusual partnership for such a long time that you become so strong. And then when you are reach that level, you can't be sort of demoralized or destroyed. So we have to ask ourselves, what is an unusual partnership for faith-based communities?
Really interesting question. Thank you. And it just reminds me how important I just keep thinking, relationships and building relationships is really crucial at this time to be really resilient.
That's what we're doing here.
It's a bit like Radio 2, isn't it? If you can think of an unusual partnership, put it in the chat. We'll give a prize for the best suggestion. Lindsay, what are your thoughts on local and national action?
So I wanted to start by saying that I know this was mentioned, but just to emphasize, the United Kingdom is the only developed country which is actually capping new fossil fuel developments. Every single developed country that is extraction wealthy is increasing. Wow. So honor that, right? Like Colombia, honor what they're trying to do. I gave Ed Miliband a hug. I would prefer that he wasn't so big on CCS. But, saying thank you to people, encouraging them because they're up against a huge pressure. And he worked nonstop at this COP. So as a developed country, it was the one country that was actually trying to show leadership. And that's because of where you voted, right? Or where people voted. And then within our own spaces, I'm going to say something that may sound a bit radical here, but Sonia talked about replacing statistics with stories, touching their hearts. I don't want to talk about climate and net zero particularly as much as I want to talk about protecting and a healthy earth, a healthy nature, a healthy climate. They are also interconnected. And I think net zero it wasn't in the Paris Agreement, but it's a cold term. It's about reducing emissions. And what are the stories we can tell about cherishing this earth, a vision for a more healthy environment, for a space that our children can grow that is less inequitable than where England has come or Britain has come in the last 30, 40 years? How can we reverse that inequity? How can we clean our rivers? How can we, our food, our land, our biodiversity is all interconnected with the climate. But many people just go, oh, you talk about climate change, and they block it. So that might bring us back into in our faith communities. And I see this here in the Quaker communities in Europe as well. You've got people who are big on climate change and they tend to sometimes people avoid them after a while because they feel lectured at. So there's a section of how do we make those stories about this is for our children, this is about building a healthier space, and I want to leave a legacy for my next generation, and I want to be an example for them of what I do in my life. So in that, yes, I know, biggest coal producer, no country is by any chance perfect, but I do want to recognize when people make an effort. Just saw that in the chat. So the last thing I'd say is, as faith voices, what is our spiritual nurturing that we're doing to our communities? Because we need to nurture people spiritually who are afraid, and we need to listen to what they're afraid about, and we need to talk about what we share in our values and what we care about, and what can we do in those moments to nourish what we care about that may be dying around us.
Thank you. Yes, and that leads us almost on to the next question. But before we go to that one, you're talking about what we emphasize. I'm chair of something locally which used to be called the South Bank and Waterloo Net Zero Partnership, and we rebranded ourselves as South Bank and Waterloo Sustains Us for a Fairer, Greener Neighbourhood, and it's made all the difference. So you're absolutely right, because that's focusing on the people, isn't it? And in that context, I'm going to come to you first, Lindsay, but in that context, we have one question which we're going to put up in full. Roche, if you could do that, which we thought was intriguing. Shouldn't we accept the human world as we know it is dying and that this is okay? Stop fighting against God's will, stop the fear and despair. No need to have hope for a big change of direction. Just learn to live kindly and joyfully from now until we die. Why can't people of faith join together on this simple, peaceful path? Climate change isn't bad or good, it's just the way it is supposed to be. And then we had some supplementaries, I think, which are the next page. So these questions, it'd be interesting if you could maybe address that first big question and maybe answer the question about what gives us hope for ourselves and inspires others. And Lindsay, I'm going to put you in the hot seat for this one.
Right, I'm in the hot seat. Just spotted Jonathan Woolley in Mexico. Hello, Jonathan, our former director. It's lovely. There's so many people here. Right, the hot seat. I would say that, and Sonia, this is inspired by you. Are we dying or are we in a rebirth? Are we a midwife? Because nature is telling us something. Whether humans or not will be able to get through that, I can't say. But I am amazed by people and the awakening that I have seen in these last years. And I'm amazed by what this potential can be when you are in this space of saying, if we do not transform, then we have what we know is going to happen. And because we work in the science, I am very aware that what we do now does make a huge difference, not just for climate, but for biodiversity, for chemical pollution, you name it. And I see all that potential. And I think I'm going to look my kids in the eye and say, I couldn't do it alone, but I was part of a movement. And that for me is really special because we're scared because it's scary. But there's also something that nature is telling us, that God is telling us. And what do our teachings in our different faith communities tell us? They're often very, very connected. And how are they asking us to cherish? So I speak to you from Germany, where I'm living right now in Bonn, and I take the train down to our office in Geneva. If I said give up, well, 80 years ago, where I live was a nightmare. And I have seen what it was. The church next to me was completely destroyed by an air bomb. Everything was destroyed. The Holocaust was not even, was still being denied here, what was going on. It takes people to rebuild. So while we are in a scary place and we are losing things and things are dying, we may be in a place of rebirth. How can we uphold that rebirth?
Thank you. That ties in with your image of the cracks opening up and the flowers coming out of them. So huge thanks for that. Sonia?
Thank you, Lindsay. And I remember our discussion at the Climate Wisdom Studio. So that's very nice. I often think of Mother Earth as a dying lady in the hospital. I'm a nurse by profession, so I worked in old age home. And if my grandmother is in hospital, I will not leave her alone there, right? You go there and you turn her over and you feed her spoon by spoon. And I was asked why I go to COP, and I could think of many fancy answers, but by the end of the day, I felt it was my duty to go there, because we have to be, as people of faith, we have to be where people are. And this is a very scary place to be. It's very doomy and gloomy and very, very stressful and high pressure. But if I leave this process, what example am I setting for others? And I feel I'm more there for other people, for souls, rather than for the planet, in a sense. And you mentioned Christiana Figueres, and we had her in our studio in COP one evening, and she talked about her main focus now is doing meditation retreats for her friends and colleagues in order to deal with the growing climate anxiety by professionals and academics and politics. So that leads me just to my final comment on this. And yes, we have to live with joy and love, no matter if the planet is dying or not. No matter, we have to be in a piece of joy and love and peace wherever we go. And now we go to the belly of the beast and we remain the same there. But in 2015, I met Johan Rockström, that you would know, Swedish professor in Germany nowadays on the planetary boundaries, and he's always very hopeful. So I asked him, how can you remain so hopeful even though everything is going in the wrong direction? What gives you hope? And he said that technology is scalable.
Right.
And I thought, and next to him was Sister Genti. And I thought, let me ask Sister Genti from Brahma Kumaris, what gives you hope? And she said that the soul is immortal. And I thought, wow, it's scalable technology and immortal soul. That's two very, very different answers to hope. And Golo was there, so I asked him. And he said that the fact that we can shape our future with the power of our mind give me hope. So I realized that everyone has their own take on hope. And when I ask myself, it's just pure kindness gives me hope.
Mm.
And when if I'm hopeless and someone smiles at me or help me or a big kind remark, everything comes back to normal again.
Yeah.
So everyone has to ask themselves and their own community what gives me hope. And will be very, very surprising answers from some of you.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, it would be interesting to get those in the chat as well. But Graham, what's your thoughts on these last questions?
Yeah, this is a good question. I've actually posted in the chat a prayer poem often attributed to Oscar Romero. And for me, it's recognizing that this is God's world, and that from a Christian point of view, and this is what Desmond Tutu often said, we know the end of the story and we've won.
Yeah.
Now that is, I think, probably from a broader interfaith perspective doesn't work for everyone. But actually, the way I approach this is I look at the fact that we are living in a battle between the two kingdoms, the kingdom of God and the kingdom of the world. And as Lindsay was saying, celebrating signs of hope is so important, but recognizing that there are structures, there is institutional sin, there are structures that have grown up, have been built up, which are above and beyond human kind of intervention, that are actually pulling us based on greed and pulling us in the wrong direction. So I think recognizing where there are changes, treating people, I think also what Lindsay said, as human beings. So giving Ed Miliband a hug is great. We may not agree with everything he's doing. He is a human being who responds to love and praise and affirmation. So I think that is important. But also, it does depend on our theology. If we have a theology that says the world will be destroyed, we could step back and say, well, it doesn't matter. I mean, I think if we have a theology that loves people, it's very hard to stay back, because actually, if you look at the fact that climate change impacts our brothers and sisters in poorer countries most, you can't hide behind a theology that says the world will be destroyed. But actually, my understanding of the Bible is the world will be renewed. We'll have a new heaven and a new earth. This earth will be renewed like our bodies will. We don't know what that looks like, but we are called, and that goes back to this prayer, we're called to work with God to bring about his kingdom. We're not in charge. We can do our best. We need to be cunning. We need to be as kind of wily as we can, as practical, as self-sacrificial. But I do think that our narratives need to change in terms of we need to celebrate success in small things. We need to find hope where it is, whilst calling out where structures and systems are not going in the right direction. And that's one thing, my final point. I lived for a number of years in Latin America, in Peru, and under a time when they were kind of prosecuting people who were involved in the 20 years of civil war. And I looked at the situation and often thought, my goodness, this is gloomy. But the people I worked with, they would celebrate every success as they went.
Yeah.
And I think that keeps hope alive, because it recognizes we are just kind of sojourners here, recognizes we're called to be part of what God's doing. And also it lifts our spirits when we recognize that what we do is making a difference, even if it's not the final difference that we want. So that's not to deny the hard situation we're in, but it's to recognize what motivates human beings and what we're called to do by our faith.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. What a great last question, and what wonderful answers you've all given. And what you said makes me think of the saying, which is attributed both to Martin Luther and the Prophet Muhammad, that if I was told the world was going to end tomorrow, I would still plant my apple tree today, or my date palm today. I've also learned recently that we're on track for a 2.75 degree increase in temperature, which is terrible. But if it wasn't for COP, we'd be on track for a 6 degree increase. That I heard recently, and that makes me think, and gives me some hope. And the other thing which gives me hope is recognizing and naming the forces of darkness as well, because I think it's important to know that we are up against, some very, very serious forces of darkness, and kind of if we can name that, then we can also name the light which exists. And we can say that a million candles makes a bright light and a transformatory light. So thank you so much. And now we've got some great statements in the chat as well about hope. So I hope we're going to save the chat and circulate it, Shannon. But we've also got some questions. We've got some good partnership suggestions as well. Those of us who were at the National Emergency Briefing last week will remember the general that Colette referred to, who was very powerful in what he said. And we've also got a suggestion for football, working with footballers. And we've got some questions, so I'm interested in both of those. We've got a question from Stephen Lingwood, which is about whether there's a faith-based theory of change that's different from other non-profits lobbying for change. I suspect that your answer to the last question has kind of touched on that, but what is our theory of change? Shall we ask that one first? Would any of you like to go first on a theory of change? No, Sonia definitely wouldn't. Lindsay, Graham, what is our theory of change? Maybe we need to give you more time to think about that one. Any answers? Yes, Lindsay, go on.
I don't have a particular theory, but I am inspired by those behind us, those who have come before us, and what they have done with their lives to bring the change that we see. And in the Quaker history, it's quite moving to think of abolition of slavery and civil rights and same-sex marriage and divesting from fossil fuels and just pushing the boundary of what is just. So that's my theory of change.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Graham, have you got any thoughts?
Yeah. One thing is, and is it a particularly Christian one or faith-based one? I mean, change is never offered to you on a plate. And I think so. All of the movements, I think it's not only faith groups, often it's the faith groups who've kind of got the long-term resilience to push through. So yeah, that's one aspect. And I think another one is that it doesn't all depend on us. So I think often either whether it's bureaucrats, whether it's even kind of activists, campaigners, it's often we like to control how things are done and what the outcome is. And I think it's just recognizing that we are part of history. We can do what we can, and building on testimonies of people who have come. So, and I think with those, I mean, values are important. I think sometimes it's some of the ways we might talk around recognizing our model needs to change, the values that underpin our model, and trying to open up some of those conversations. So it's often these are things that faith groups may have in common with others, but maybe aren't the mainstream of most of the others, but you'll still find that commonality with other groups as well.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think in some ways, sorry, go on, Sonia.
Yeah, I think the change I like to talk about is the personal change, because that's the only change I can actually talk about as a person. And as people of faith, we do have excellent tools for personal change. So I have to check myself to what degree have I removed fear. Yeah. Greed is one common factor for climate crisis. And to what extent have I removed my greed? To what extent can I take power from God when I'm faced with climate emergency? To what extent can I remain peaceful and help other people? And to change my diet to a more plant-based diet is the biggest step any individual can do to help the planet. And how far have I come there? And as people of faith, we should be examples because we have the tools.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would concur with all that you've all said, but also remember that non-faith actors, their theory of change works as well. It's about putting pressure as well. It's about applying pressure where pressure works. It's about encouraging people to change their own lives, but also to engage with the corridors of power and the levers of power in different waves. Otherwise, nothing will happen. And things clearly do, as you say. Lindsay, you talk about some great examples of ways things have changed in the past. A final question in the last few minutes, which is the one from Chris Philpott, which I think connects, well, obviously it does, but those of us who've read Raiding Sweetgrass might remember the deep connections with nature that we often kind of skate over. So I just wondered if you wanted to make some final observations on how we engage with the world, with the created world, and whether that might or might not be helpful in this struggle. Maybe I'll go, Graham, to you first.
So what was the question?
Well, the question is, I've just put it in the chat. It's about shamanism. What faith were the indigenous people following? Were they followers of the native shamanic traditions? But I think there's a wider question about how we engage with nature as well as other people. Graham, I'm going to give you the opportunity, and then Sonia, and then Lindsay can have the last word, as you had the hot seat last time.
Yeah, the indigenous people who I think they had a huge range of kind of religion and practice. So I couldn't necessarily comment on specifics. But what is common in all of the kind of indigenous worldviews is this the role of nature and the earth and nature as a kind of living and part of kind of who we are, and the fact that that comes first. So in a way, the value on nature is not economic, and so a lot of the kind of challenges that indigenous groups brought were around and they were around the model of nature being kind of mother, father, and not a commodity. And actually, the way it's talked about in terms of a lot of financing or carbon capture and storage or credits is about a commodification of nature. Now that goes to the kind of the core of the model that we have, and it's very easy to have those discussions outside. But and actually, what you need to do, I think, sometimes is develop alternatives about what does this look like in practice. But I think bringing those voices and that challenge, and also showing that alternatives are possible in terms of agroecology, agroforestry, different models of development, is positive. The challenge is that you're dealing with small scale kind of heterogeneous models compared to kind of homogeneous, let's just chop it down and sell the timber or plant big large scale cultivations. So it's working out how you get funding for that and how some of those examples will cut through. But having indigenous people with experience at the table, at the discussions, is absolutely vital, because they, in my experience, will often start with that before moving to whatever solutions they're proposing.
Thank you very much. Sonia.
I took a flight from Salvador to Belém, and flying into the Amazonas, someone asked me, did you ask for permission if you could enter? And I remember when I also was in Peru and I was going up to the mountains, and someone asked me, you have to ask permission if you can enter Machu Picchu. And yes, so I know the indigenous have this very vivid relationship with nature, and I did ask for permission, and my health stayed well all the 2 weeks in the extreme heat. And in our meeting, internal BK meeting, we started with the indigenous celebration. So we did the ceremony with the leaves, wishing in all 4 directions. They work very much with the 4 directions, with the circle, and respecting. But of course, at the core of it is that you don't take more than you need. And you respect nature and you keep the balance. So you keep the balance within your diet, within your hunting, within your cutting trees, never more than you need, always in balance with nature. And I think that's the greatest lesson we can learn from the indigenous, that we don't have more things we need, and we don't eat more than we need. We don't waste anything. Everything is in balance. Also our thoughts.
Yeah, living sustainably on every level. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Lindsay, finally, your thoughts.
The presence of Indigenous peoples in the COPs in these negotiations is critical. It's something we in our organization have been supporting for years because it brings the nature. Otherwise, the COP is about money and power. And so pushing to ensure that the science is respected, but the Indigenous voice is respected and integrated, because the Indigenous voice is about our relationship with the earth. The science is our kind of statistic of a reminder. If you've not read A Dawn of Anything, think about reading this book. It's very intense, but it is fascinating because what our Indigenous histories are helping us to understand that maybe the way we live now in our capitalist hierarchies is not the way that we as human beings naturally could live. And actually, Indigenous people's rights are different from human rights. They're about communal rights. I'm going to give you two quotes. Someone just gave Joanna Macy, seeing the sacred in life. That is a spiritual grounding each day. I'm going to leave you with a quote from Ala Abdel El Fattah, who was released from prison in Egypt after 12 years and is half British. His quote that so moved me as he came out, which was, first, focus on how humanity can live together. And then he said, there is a deadlock of imagination in the global north, and there is a deadlock of possibility in the global south. So I would encourage us here in this call from the UK, open our imaginations.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Yeah, imagination keeps coming up in my life at the moment, so thank you for that reminder as well. We're going to hold a moment of silence with one another. But before I do, I just want to say thank you so much to you all for speaking and for bringing your thoughts, your wisdom, and also your vulnerability and your openness to this conversation. I'm really grateful. It was recorded, so we will be able to circulate it, and we'll also keep the chat. I want to say thank you to everyone who joined us on the call as well, and thanks for all that you're all doing. There are some old friends and new friends on the call. Thank you all for being with us. And, we have our task. Graham particularly has given us a task for the coming year. If you're not already on the our newsletter mailing list, please do visit the Faith for Climate website and sign up for the e-news. Or follow us on social media, and we will keep this conversation going alongside our partners and those who we work with very closely. But I have some good news, actually, which I'm going to share as well, which is that the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust have confirmed Faith for the Climate's funding for another 3 years, which we're really delighted about. So we're now thinking hard about how we can, we can now do some strategic planning for the next 3 years, in fact, 5 years. But that's a huge relief to us, as you can imagine. And I like that outburst of hearts. Yes, exactly. And congratulations to Shannon, who was really the leader on that. So let's just keep a moment of silence, and then I'll let you all go and ask the speakers to stay on for a quick debrief. So thank you. We'll keep some silence.